So good afternoon, dear colleagues. I have been asked by the chair to replace him for the last part of our meeting. We are now to continue our work with item 12 of the agenda. So on the item 12 of the agenda, we have the presentation of a working document relate to the own initiative report on the implementation of Article 17 of the Common Fisheries Regulation. This initiative report was allocated to the group, the Greens, EFA, and Mrs. Caroline Roose was appointed the rapporteur. Mrs. Roose presents us today a working document that is the basis for the draft report that it will be completed and presented in the December or maybe the January committee meeting. The presentation will be by Mrs. Roose will be followed by the inputs of two experts as requested by the rapporteur and approved by the coordinators who are connected remotely. The two experts are Mr. Carpenter, Griffin Carpenter, fisheries expert from the NGO New Economics Foundation, and Mr. Gerard van Balsfoort, chairman of l'Association des Chalutiers Congélateurs Pelagic. Mrs. Roose, as the rapporteur, you have the floor to present the working document. Please, Mrs. Roose.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very happy to see that we are going to have a first discussion on this very key issue today, where we're talking about implementation of Article 17 of the CFP. Now, as you know, the deadlines are quite tight. We have to finish our work quite quickly to then be able to ensure that our work actually feeds into the global report that is being prepared on the CFP by Gabriel Mato. Now, we have a working document before us that basically outlines the state of play on this issue, the progress that has been made. And for the last 2 weeks, I've been able to gain some more information on the topic by meeting different fisheries representatives, small-scale fisheries, large vessels, owners, producers, NGOs, as well as the national public authorities as well as European public authorities. We've been carried out different studies, and we have also talked to low impact fisheries and our fish, different organizations. Now, in these reports and the exchanges that we'll have today will allow us to continue to work on this topic. First off, in this introduction, I would like to correct one factual error that has entered the working document. This is with respect to France Pelagic. Now, France Pelagic is a company that has not bought a number of vessels, but in fact only one vessel. And the vessel was not actually destroyed, but in fact resold to another company in Guinea-Bissau. Now, in my working document, it's true that I only looked at data from the press, and I didn't necessarily reach out to the company in question. But now I have been in contact with France Pelagic, and therefore I would like to correct this factual error that has slipped into my document. Now, coming on to the implementation of Article 17 of the CFP. Now, the main issue here is who has the right to fish, what do they have the right to fish in the European Union. We're also talking about equitable sharing of fishing opportunities. The European Union sets up TACs, total allowable catches, for the total fisheries allowed. And these TACs are then divided among member states according to the principle of relative stability. Now, within each member state, these fishing opportunities are then distributed among different fishery companies and organizations. The distribution of these possibilities is member state competence, for sure. However, the CFP regulation does in fact set across set out certain obligations and certain possibilities for member states while keeping Article 17 in mind. Now, Article 17 cannot be taken in isolation from the rest of the CFP and has to be seen within the context of the social, economic, and environmental objectives of the CFP. Article 17 is a key element of the CFP. Now, why are we looking at this issue today in terms of distribution of fishing opportunities? Now, this is because we're facing a number of different issues. When we're talking about the management plan in the Atlantic, there we've seen that there was an unequal distribution of fishing opportunities between small-scale and large-scale fisheries, and the European Parliament very strongly asked for a more equitable distribution of fishing opportunities. Furthermore, in France, for example, small-scale fisheries have in fact started legal proceedings for unequal or unfair distribution of fishing opportunities. Now, the first instance court has in fact ruled. The French state has taken some action, but nonetheless, this is an expression of the discontent among small-scale fisheries as to how the CFP is being implemented. And when we're talking about the social and economic implications as well, not all the objectives have been reached in terms of conservation either. The different conditions within Article 17 have not been exploited to the greatest extent by member states, and I'll go into detail later. Furthermore, this report, or rather the report on the farm to fork strategy that we voted on plenary recently, the Parliament asked for transition towards a low-impact fisheries system with most allocations going to low-impact small-scale fisheries. Now, in terms of implementation of Article 17, we see that each member state is implementing it differently. Now, I have nonetheless focused on what we see the most. Firstly, the transparency criteria. In the European Parliament report in 2015 and the NEF report in 2017 said that most countries were lacking in terms of transparency. Information in terms of how quotas are distributed are very difficult to gain. And of course, this makes it difficult to look at evaluate implementation of Article 17. There's not much traceability in terms of quotas, and some companies have published their plans voluntarily, but that's not something that happens often. Now, in terms of criteria, now the criteria is actually quite simple, looking at the impact of fisheries. However, in the research that I've done, representatives of low-impact small-scale fisheries have said that according to them, this criteria has been not been properly used, and the criteria of historical catches doesn't actually work. They do not, small-scale fisheries do not report catches in the same way as large-scale fisheries, and therefore they are disadvantaged today. So this doesn't mean that we need to call the whole anteriority criteria into question, but we have to adapt it to the European fleet from the economic and social perspective. Furthermore, there are also other criteria that can be used, and here we're looking at environmental and social criteria. Another point that I want to raise is the use of environmental, social, and economic criteria. Now, Article 17 actually provides a few examples of the same: the environmental impact, the contribution to local economy. You have vessels using low impact fishing gear, low impact and passive capture technologies. So in this way, we limit the impact on the habitat. In 2021, NEF noted that 17 member states were not talking about sustainable and fair distribution of fishing opportunities. There were 12 countries that use social criteria, 11 that use environmental criteria. However, this doesn't weigh very heavily on final distribution of quotas. Now, I think Catalonia has a very interesting case. 5% of days are allocated as conservation incentives dedicated to fishers adopting additional measures for the conservation of fishing resources and ecosystems. That's a positive example. Furthermore, in Denmark, for example, there is a quota reserved for boats under 17 meters and using passive gears. Also, there's something to incentivize new entrants and to help them enter TAC fisheries. To support this, also our colleague Mr. Pidao has had a report that has also looked at this measure favorably. Now, when we're looking at the CFP and the objectives set out there, we also look at SDGs, and keeping this in mind, the member states should use environmental and social criteria to a greater extent. We have to always remember that all of these criteria do not move in the same direction, or the kind of fleet might not necessarily always be the ones with the lowest environmental impact, lowest emissions, lowest habitat damage, but it's a balancing act. I think that there is important work still outstanding, and I think that the Commission needs to be more proactive in this regard. They can provide proposals to the member states on objective criteria that can be implemented. They need to be effective to ensure that this article is implemented in a uniform way all across the EU, that they actually respond to local fishermen's needs. And in regions where generational renewal has been identified as a specific issue, a section of the quota should be reserved for new entrants. While there are some sensitive issues, secondly, we can also have performance indicators. Some part of the quota can look at performance indicators, i.e. amount of catch, to actually allocate quotas, and in this way, fisheries can make the most of their investment. In terms of small-scale fisheries, they should have a specific quota themselves, and we should make sure that the possibilities provided within Article 17 must be used to the max. We can use these criteria to create very effective public instruments. We cannot implement an ecosystemic approach of fisheries while taking into account the fishing opportunities. So as I said, there's a lot to be done to balance all of these different issues, to make sure the fishing opportunities are distributed in a fairer way, and that we're managing this common resource in the best possible way. Furthermore, this is the only way which will allow us to reach the framework directive objectives, to the objectives within the biodiversity strategy. And in this meeting today, hopefully we will be able to contribute to this debate, and we will be able to take action in this ambitious area to make sure that fishing opportunities are distributed in the fairest possible way. Furthermore, the study that was presented to me was from the New Economic Foundation. It's from 2017. It's a very comprehensive study, and I've asked them to update this figure as well. So I'm very happy, really, that we have a representative from NEF here today to present the study to us. Thank you very much.
Roose.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roose.
Give the word to the two experts, and we start with Mr. Carpenter. You have the floor for maximum 10 minutes, please.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you to the committee for considering this important issue. My name is Griffin Carpenter. I'm an environmental economist, and I've been working on fisheries for a number of years now, and this issue of how fishing opportunities are allocated is a special interest of mine, and I was producing the report that was referred to, Who Gets to Fish, which was just updated in 2021, so pleased to share some very recent findings. So given the expertise present, I'll keep my background on EU legislation brief, and then more detail on kind of my assessment of everything. So just the brief part, fishing opportunities are defined as a quantified legal entitlement to fish, and this is expressed in terms of catches or fishing effort, even spatial area, exclusive right to a square kilometer. That would be a fishing opportunity. It gives you the right to that. And the critical point here is that fishing opportunities are one of the main tools of management, maybe even the most important tool we have. So if you look in other sectors, automotive sector, if you want to encourage certain outcomes, well, it's taxation. You can tax fuels, petrol and diesel more or less, and electricity, registration taxes on new cars. In farming, it's subsidies. You can subsidize certain types of farming, reserve an amount of funding for new entrants, or for planting hedgerows or whatever it may be. In fisheries, the fishing opportunities are the resource that's available here. So if you give more of that opportunity to a certain type of fishing, that's what you're incentivizing. So it's a really important tool here. If you don't have any fishing opportunities, you can't go fish. You're just a seafarer at that point. So, in that extreme sense, fishing opportunities are the most important tool there. Now, of course, if you're indifferent to how fishing takes place, if you're indifferent to the marine environment, then it doesn't matter how you use this tool. But when we look at either the CFP regulation, or we look at other policies and commitments, be that the SDGs, biodiversity commitments, there's actually a lot of objectives we have. So this is a public resource here. So in fact, there's more objectives that we have in the fisheries space that we want to achieve than elsewhere. Because although we allow individuals, businesses, to use the public resource for their own commercial purposes, it is a public resource, so it makes sense that we might be more demanding in this space. So that's the background context, and that's why in 2013 there was a lot of excitement around Article 17 in the CFP reform, because finally this tool that's available would be used, and fisheries might look quite different. So here we are in 2021 looking backwards, and not a lot has changed actually in this time. So I'll comment on, just in general what we see in how fishing opportunities are allocated, and then comment specifically on Article 17, what it means for implementation. And I'll comment specifically on fishing quotas. They're the main fishing opportunity that are used. They're also easier to compare across countries. So yeah, the majority of catches actually fall under fishing quotas, putting all fishing areas together. So historical catch is king in this space. It's the most common criteria that's being used. The reasons for this are mostly simplicity, assessing the catch records that were used in the past with different fishers, keeping that in place over time, and saying if you're fishing 3% in this reference period, every year you get 3%. If in the past you were fishing 3% of the North Sea cod, that vessel just continues to be allocated the same amount of quota. So it's simple. It kind of has the appearance of some sort of neutrality, keeping things the same. But of course, this is heavily value-laden. To say that the status quo should continue into the future is a judgment, just like any other. Given all the objectives we have in fisheries, we might actually not hold to that same objective of the status quo. And then, of course, some fishers would say, well, what you're doing is you're incentivizing those who are overfishing in the past, because you're saying those who are overfishing the most, 10% of the cod or 20% of the cod, they continue to get that allocation. So there's actually a perverse incentive there in historically overfishing. So historical catch is heavily criticized, yet it continues to be the most common criteria that's being used here. The second most common criteria, and this is the only other one I'll comment on because it's mostly just two, is vessel size. And generally how this looks is that there will be separate allocations for the large-scale fleet and the small-scale fleet. Not all countries have this, but roughly half of the member states do with fishing fleets. So you might say if the vessels are under 10 meters or under 12 meters, they might have a separate quota pool, and you can increase the amount of quota that's going into that pool or not. So some member states have prioritized this. They want to keep that small-scale fleet active for maybe some other objectives that are correlated with size. And those are basically the two most common. So historical catches and sometimes vessel size is being used. Now, beyond historical catches and vessel size, we can see some trends that I can comment on. So, for example, the duration of fishing quota is different in different countries. Some might just allocate quota for 1 year, and then come January the next year, they'll have the opportunity to allocate quota again and can do it differently. In some other member states, they might specify a length of time. So you'll be allocated a certain percentage of quota, 3% of the cod, and that's for 10 years or for 16 years, or perhaps even indefinitely, especially in market systems where payments are being made for this quota. There's also a legal gray area where sometimes it's not specified. So the quota might be allocated by member states each year, and if they don't change their allocation system, if it's always based on historical catches, then an expectation is developed. So this is why it's important, if a change is going to be made, to give early indications. Now, I'll just highlight a couple interesting examples of systems we see before commenting on Article 17 in particular. So as was mentioned in the Rapporteur's speech, there are some quota reserves where quota is set aside for specific purposes. So for example, for people trying to enter the fishing industry, it's very hard, it's very expensive these days. So a certain set of quota can be set aside as a loan. Some countries, Bulgaria and Greece, have pretty formalized points-based systems. So you'll give information on maybe the age of the fishing, if you're employing local crew, and that turns into the fishing opportunities that you're allocated. And in general, what we see is that some of these interesting adaptations on systems are applied when new quota is introduced. So bluefin tuna, for example, when there's a quota rise or when it's introduced for a new species, then member states get a bit more creative and they might allocate differently, breaking away from just historical catches. So my advice to member states in this area would be to make old quota new again. If you're allocating quota the same way and it's hard to break that expectation, then you have to give something like a notice period to say in 5 years, we're going to allocate quota in a different way. So people can recoup the investments they've made in vessels, and then in 5 years, there can be a more dramatic change to the quota system. It seems like that's what's going to be needed because there's been so little change in this space. So now on Article 17 in particular, and in my assessment, I looked at the 22 countries with fishing fleets. 17 of these were using historical landings, 13 were using vessel size, and then around 11 or 12 were using some sort of criteria, environmental criteria, social criteria. These often are not common across member states. Some might consider age, some might look at profitability or quota uptake, saying if you're not catching all your quota, then we're going to remove some of that quota from your next year's holdings. So there's no real common trends there. Now, while I tried to communicate these findings, there's a lot that went behind those numbers, and this was very difficult to assess. So I don't want to give the appearance of ease. Transparency is extremely low in this area. And this is reflected from parliamentary questions to the Commission, where they basically say, we don't know how member states are allocating their fishing opportunities, but we have no reason to think that Article 17 isn't being followed. So evidence of absence. There's no way to actually say whether or not all these ambitious criteria are being met because the first criteria on transparency is so difficult. So a lot of this information is gained by talking to producer organizations, to fishers, people within governments, but it's not publicly available. Now, so in assessing transparency, I found only 7 of the member states were describing their systems online, saying what criteria they apply, and only 4 of those are saying actually how the criteria are weighted against each other. So you can say that some quota is being allocated for minimum ecosystem damage, but we don't know if that's 1% or possibly even less. So we really need that full transparency. And in the end, how much quota is going to each fisher? Well, only 2 countries, Denmark and Estonia, say this. So in conclusion, fishing opportunities are this critical tool for fisheries management because they determine not just how much is fished, but who is catching that fish and how. And it's been underutilized in the past. There's great excitement about the CFP reform in Article 17, but we're not seeing many changes in fisheries management systems since 2013. Most systems look almost identical, despite the fact that this new regulation was in place. So in 2021, it seems like the excitement was unfounded. Historical catch is still king, and vessel size coming in second place in terms of criteria. Minimal use of social and environmental criteria, and transparency, which is the most obligatory and the most necessary of all the different requirements of Article 17 isn't being met, so everything else becomes more difficult to assess. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I ask now Mr. Van Balsfoort. We will listen to your comments for a maximum of 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. First, to present myself, my name is indeed Gerard van Balsfoort. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm president of an association of pelagic trawlers who are flagged in 6 member states of the EU: France, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and England. England is not anymore, of course, a member state, but still we have vessels there. I want to start to thank Madame Roose for correcting just now the mentioning of one of our members, France Pelagic, in the working document. The inclusion of the paragraph about France Pelagic was based on a wrong assumption. Unfortunately, in my view, this working document is based on a number of assumptions that are wrong or biased or both. I explain myself. The first assumption, which I feel is wrong, is that the report states that the member states have failed to implement Article 17 of the CFP Basic Regulation. Fact is, however, that as far as I know, the European Commission, as guardian of the CFP, has until now never started an infringement procedure against any member state for not having implemented Article 17.
Mr. Balsfoort, we are having problems in listening because there are some background noise.
Yes, I'm in a hotel in the lounge. I cannot change because here is the internet connection best. So I hope you can follow me. I try to speak loud and clear.
Is going? Okay, so we are going to have French interpretation. So please continue.
Okay. So if the Commission never has started an infringement procedure, I must understand that for the European Commission, all member states have allocated their fishing opportunities with transparent and objective criteria as mentioned in Article 17. Secondly, the report assumes that Article 17 obliges member states to use criteria of an environmental nature or to use compliance records to allocate quota or base quota allocation also on the use of more selective gears, etc. This is, however, not what Article 17 says. The only obligation written in Article 17 is that the criteria used for the allocation of quota must be transparent and objective. What precise criteria member states will use, historical catches or environmental criteria or compliance records, whatever, is a matter of choice for the member state. This is a may provision in the text and not a shall provision. And I remember at the time of the reform, this was a huge discussion about may or shall provision in Article 17. Article 17 continues with expressing that member states shall endeavour to provide incentives for the use of more selective gear. Also, this text is very open and cannot be seen as an obligation to member states to use the quota allocation process for this purpose. The above is also confirmed by the EU Court of Justice in a judgment C540/16 that states that taking into account the track records for the allocation of fishing opportunities of species under quota is a way to consider the economic and social dimension. Furthermore, the EU Court of Justice considers in this same judgment that member states are not obliged to take into account all the criteria mentioned in Article 17, but mainly, as I said, have the obligation to adopt transparent and objective criteria. Thirdly, in the working document, an artificial conflict is created between large-scale versus small-scale fishers. That conflict does simply not really exist in reality in many EU coastal communities. As a general rule, big vessels exploit stocks not accessible to small vessels. The so-called industrial or large-scale fishing companies referred to in the report are all of them family businesses that have existed for generations and are deeply rooted in and connected to local fishing communities in all member states, as far as I know. This applies really to all fishing companies in Europe. Large and small-scale vessels all have their place under the sun. In general, they are not in competition with each other. There are some exemptions, of course, but in general not. They mostly fish for different species in mostly different fishing grounds, for often different markets. Very often, both fleet segments are even interdependent. For instance, in many ports, the infrastructure would often be unsustainable without large-scale fishing vessels providing the continuity of landings necessary to support marketing and logistical facilities. 4. Article 17 only talks about allocation of fishing opportunities or quota. The small-scale fleet, however, in many cases, is not targeting species that are managed under the tag and quota system, but target non-quota species. Often, and certainly in France, the small-scale fleet enjoys preferential access to these non-quota species and to fishing grounds near the shore to catch these species. Species and fishing grounds not accessible to the large-scale fleet. Point 5. The working document assumes that the small-scale fishermen better perform in environmental terms. This assumption, however, is questionable. There are many criteria to monitor environmental performance. It must be acknowledged that the environmental performance by small-scale fishermen, such as bycatch or habitat disturbance, is less known because these are less recorded than for large-scale vessels. One aspect of environmental performance is recorded by STECF in their annual report on the performance of the EU fishing fleets. This is the use of fuel per kilo of fish produced, kind of carbon footprint. Here, STECF clearly stipulates that consistently the small-scale fleet uses more fuel per kilo of fish than the large-scale fleet. And I don't, just to be clear, I don't want to portray the small-scale fleet as detrimental for the environment. I just want to underline one of the biased assumptions of this working document. 6. There is a reason why some fisheries are operating large-scale vessels compared with other fleets. As an example, my own fisheries, Pelagic. Everywhere in the world, pelagic fisheries has developed into a large-scale fleet. Why this is? The TACs, the quota, have very large volumes. For instance, the ICES advice for the TAC for North Sea herring next year amounts to 532,000 tons to be caught in the Channel and the North Sea. The value, secondly, the value of pelagic fish is really low. The competition in pelagic fish is very high and is global. Therefore, to survive as fishing company, you have to apply economies of scale, develop into fleets of fewer but larger vessels to become more cost efficient. That is how the economy works in all sectors, not only in fisheries. No small-scale fisherman is able to fish herring or blue whiting and to stay competitive on the marketplace. Impossible. That's why they don't fish for these species, even if they were given quota with small-scale vessels. Finally, the working document ends with the recommendation to redistribute 30% of the quota. This means first to take away this 30% from existing fishing companies. In a few member states, fish quota have the legal form of individual transferable quota, ITQs. For instance, Denmark, the Netherlands and Sweden. Often these ITQs, these individual transferable quota, have been bought for vast sums of money by investing this. But in almost all member states, fishing companies have an entitlement to receive annually a fixed share of the quota based on their historical track record. To take away 30% from all of them would not only be a devastating blow to their company's viability, but would also lead to a multitude of legal procedures against the member state, because this would be a breach against the principles of legitimate expectations, acquired rights and legal certainty. Conclusion, my conclusion, I am not convinced by the content of this working document. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I apologize for the bad technical conditions. Now we will open the debate, and I will give first the word to the shadow rapporteurs and then to the colleagues that want to intervene. So we start with the shadow rapporteur from the EPP, our colleague Mr. Peter van Dalen. Please.
Hartelijk dank, voorzitter.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair, and thank you to our colleague Mrs. Roose for her working document. Let me be blunt and say straight away that I'm not entirely enthusiastic about this working document, and I have a number of reasons for that. First of all, it strikes me that it's a fairly one-dimensional document looking at sustainable small-scale fisheries, which comes as a surprise, I must say, because at the bottom of the work document, and as it says at the bottom of all of our working document, it says Europe is united in diversity, and diversity goes to the heart of fisheries. We have all types of catches, all types of vessels, and we need all of those vessels and types of catches so that we can guarantee food, not just for ourselves, but fish is a protein which is also important for millions of people in continents such as Africa. And sustainable fisheries is something that the large vessels are involved in too. Think of the North Sea. It's one of the most regulated and best regulated seas in the world, and the stocks are healthy. So the thrust of my first comment is to say, please have prospects for all fisheries and not just for small-scale fisheries. Secondly, then, in the document it is stated that 30% of the quota needs to be transferred to the small-scale fishers. Now, Madam Chair, if this were to happen, then in most member states this would be the death knell of fisheries, because that type of shift is something that no sector would survive. I also don't really know where the percentage comes from. It could be 5, 30, 80. It could have a numbers bingo. But where did you get the 30% then? Where did you find that number? Thirdly, you're critical of the historical catch rights because you say that that doesn't lead to innovation. I don't understand, Madam Chair. In my country, there are many historical catch rights, yet we're one of the most innovative fisheries countries in Europe. And the most innovative fishery method, which was environmentally friendly, which reduced CO2, which was selective and so on, pulse fishing, was basically banned by this Parliament. And then, most importantly, Madam Chair, Article 17 itself. I would invite everyone to look at this closely, because you can't read it in isolation. You need to read it in conjunction with Article 16. And Article 16 talks about catch opportunities and how this is made available, how this is allocated. It may be done on the basis of criteria which are social, economic or environmental in nature. May. It doesn't say shall. So please let's not tinker with this. I think the terms of the provisions are clear, and Article 17 needs to be read in conjunction with Article 16 and interpreted in that light. Then, prospects for young fishers, like in Denmark, that must be possible. Well, fine. Let's produce a document of which everyone says this really gives us prospects for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have now for the S&D group, Mrs. Carmen Avram. She's online.
Yes. Thank you very much. First of all, Mr. Bartolo would like to apologize for not being able to be here for this discussion. He's currently traveling to Bosnia for a mission linked to his activity as LIBE Vice President, and he could not be connected from remote either. So he asked me to read his intervention on his behalf. Without any doubt, Article 17 is one of the most important political levers the EU has at its disposal for the achievement of the social and environmental objectives enshrined within the CFP. The fact that it remains largely unimplemented is due to the inertia demonstrated by member states who seem to be deaf to any call for balancing a distribution system still too favorable to the segment of the large industrial fisheries. This fact became crystal clear during the recent negotiations for the transposition of the latest ICCAT provisions, when some member states vetoed the agreement already reached in trialogue, an agreement that included only a simple, non-binding recommendation by the Parliament calling for a more balanced allocation of quota between large and small fisheries. Yet the situation seems glaringly obvious. In Italy, to cite an example, small-scale fisheries is assigned practically 5% of blue funtina quotas, despite representing almost 70% of the fleet, employing more environmentally sustainable tools and performing better in terms of economic efficiency and job generation than industrial fishing. At such a difficult time for our fisheries sector, a fairer distribution system that guarantees a wider allocation of fishing opportunities to the small-scale fisheries segment would undoubtedly bring about greater economic and social benefits in line with the objectives of the CFP. Moreover, it would encourage a more effective transition towards the objectives of the Green Deal for more sustainable fisheries and promote a very much needed generational change in the sector. At the same time, we all know how difficult it could be to change the situation in legal terms, as quota allocations remain exclusive competence of member states. In this regard, I would like to ask the experts how, in their view, the Parliament and the Commission could intervene within the sphere of the competences in order to change the status quo and bring about change towards a complete achievement of Article 17. Finally, I want to thank the Rapporteur for having promoted its INI and for the excellent working document produced. I look forward to the report to begin our work together with the other shadow rapporteurs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I ask now the shadow rapporteur from the Renew Group, Mrs. Bilbao Barandica, please.
Sí, buenas tardes. Gracias, Presidenta.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to thank you for your work in drafting this document. On Article 17, what I would like to look at is the following. Article 17 establishes as an obligation for member states to be transparent when allocating these fishing opportunities. And to reach the objectives of the common fisheries policy, this needs to be done in environmentally and socially sustainable terms. Of course, the type of local economy involved and many different criteria need to be included. And each one of the member states can apply these criteria. Furthermore, the possibility to include incentives and for member states to make an effort to include incentives, that's also included in the document now. I have the feeling that we've been questioning the 3 paragraphs as if we were speaking of an obligation. We have all approved and we all agree to the common fisheries policy, and the basic principles of transparency, of course, apply. And the criteria listed therein, of course, need to be applied by the member states. Now, one of the problems is artisanal fisheries. When we speak of artisanal fishery, or what is the definition? We're speaking of small-scale fisheries, small-scale fisheries and artisanal fisheries. What exactly do we mean there when we're looking at vessels which are 25 meters long and we're still speaking of artisanal fisheries vessels? So this is the first problem, the definition of small-scale artisanal fisheries. and then the different structures within the fisheries sector. Investing in a vessel is very expensive, and those who are going to launch a fisheries business, of course, need to have some form of stability. If they can't find the stability in the quotas, where can they find it? And then, of course, the restructuring in the fisheries sector nowadays is truly of concern for all types of vessels, small, medium and large. And why is that? Because of the reality. There is overexploitation of the fisheries stocks. And of course, this is something we need to consider. There needs to be some form of legal certainty. And then the elimination from the report of the big trawlers, that's a good thing, I think. Now, there's a further point I would like to raise. We cannot have a report in the European Parliament which is filled with information which we've read in the press, in the media. This is what is happening, particularly in the fisheries sector. News which comes up in the press, left, right and centre, is then included into a document. This is unacceptable. We need to look at youth and how we can attract youngsters into the fisheries sector. What kind of incentives could we offer to youngsters to be able to enter the fisheries sector? Well, there needs to be some form of certainty, and that can be provided by the quotas. Furthermore, what about subsidies or some form of assistance to new fisheries vessels, to new fisheries businesses? This would be a thought that I wanted to share. And now fairness. What is fairness? What is behind this concept? We need to look at the differences in various sectors. And in this case, we need to look at the criteria and also create trust. The people in the sector need to trust us and need to trust the stability of the sector. And then furthermore, the 30% of criteria which is environmentally based or socially based, well, now economic sustainability, that's very important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't address environmental issues and social issues, but we really need to look at it holistically. And particularly stability, that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now asking our colleague, the shadow from ECR, Mr. Ruissen, to speak, please.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Rapporteur for her working document, which she presented to us. Let me put it this way. The working document gives us food for thought. And I'm interested to see what will be in the report, which will flow from the working document. And I think it will be a challenge to agree on these types of issues amongst ourselves. I must be honest and say that in this working document there are a number of main tenets which throw up questions. Now, these main tenets that lead to questions in my mind. Well, first of all, the main point you make, which is that small and artisanal is per definition good, and that large-scale fisheries by definition cannot be sustainable. This is something which permeates your working document, and it does no justice to what happens on the ground. Large-scale fisheries, which are efficient, can also be sustainable, in particular if this is done in the context of quotas. So that is an approach which I don't like a great deal, I must say. Secondly then, What is missing from the report, as I see it, is the importance of subsidiarity. Now, I make this point because I think we need to appreciate that the situation differs greatly from member state to member state. In certain member states, you have small artisanal fisheries of a certain size and a certain importance. In other member states, that's not the case. So when attributing quotas, I think it's important to take into account that there are differences between the countries. And I think we need to be very careful and not be too prescriptive from Brussels and tell member states how they should be allocating their quota. And that's also why this proposal to take out 30% of the quota from existing fisheries and to redistribute it is something I don't like, because that's a top-down approach. That's Brussels imposing certain matters, and I don't think it will work in a great many of our member states. I'm critical of it. What does warrant our attention is how we deal with new entrants, young fishers who want to get started in the sector, the new generation basically. There are some bottlenecks, some issues, and we need to look at that. How can we make sure that young fishers have prospects for the future? How can we flesh this out? I'm happy to consider that. But again, I think this is a discussion which needs to take place at national level first, because again, it depends on the member state. And again, subsidiarity is the watchword. Last comment then, transparency. Well, yes, I agree. The criteria need to be transparent. That's also what the regulation says. But if transparency is taken to mean that you need to provide data and publish data in relation to companies, and you want company data, and when you talk about the size of the quota, that's what you're talking about, then I think you need to be fairly careful there. You need to be cautious. So transparency, yes, but to a point. There need to be limits. So those would be the main points that I would make now in having read your working document the first time. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I don't think that the shadow from the left is connect, Mr. João Pimenta Lopes, no? Or from ID? No. Okay, so now we go to other colleagues that want to intervene. We have already the indication that Mrs. Schreijer-Pierik is online and wants to speak, please.
Voorzitter, dank u wel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dear colleague Rosa, when I read this, I must say I got a stomach ache, and this is cause for concern. The impression is given here that small-scale and artisanal fisheries should be given a greater share of the quota, and up to 30% of the fishing opportunity should be allocated on the basis of social and environmental criteria. Could I remind you that if you read Article 17 of the CFP, it says may. It's a may provision. And you also need to look at Article 16. The member states will decide for themselves how to allocate their quota in keeping with the principle of subsidiarity. And that needs to remain the case. Many fishers have invested along these lines. We had the young fishers from the Netherlands. You've all seen it. They're very innovative and they're making investments. Now, with your document, basically, you're causing a lot of disquiet. You talk about incentives for non-selective gear. But how about pulse fisheries? We all know what happened to that. How about the seafloor and environmental aspects there? And you have fisheries fleets that are efficient from an economic point of view, and they should also be allowed to exist. It says here that small-scale and coastal fisheries makes up 75% of the fleet. but 45% of the catches falls to 25% of the fleet. How more efficient can this become? And I would invite you to look at that. The same goes for energy consumption and the CO2 footprint per fish caught. Madam Chair, and Mrs. Roose, don't misunderstand me. I'm in favour of small-scale fisheries, but I'm also in favour of large-scale fisheries. And I think there's a place for both in Europe. We need to respect each other, and we need to be guided by the principle of subsidiarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I ask now Mrs. Grace Sullivan to intervene. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and I hope you can hear me clearly. I would like to congratulate the Rapporteur, Caroline Roose, for her very important working document on the implementation of Article 17 of the CFP. And having listened to my other colleagues, I do think the objective here is to find balance when it comes to distribution of stocks amongst both the larger and the smaller fleet segments. But for me, this report is very important in terms of fairness and sustainability. In my own constituency in Ireland, small-scale and low-impact fisheries in Ireland are currently seeking a fair share of the national mackerel quota, where over 95% of the quota goes to only 49 large vessels. So for coastal communities, the lower impact hook and line mackerel fisheries actually represents an opportunity for both the local economy and the sustainability of fisheries. Yet the small scale fishers simply do not have access as the bigger fishers do. So Article 17, which directs member states to use environmental and social criteria for allocating quota, could transform EU fisheries and our overexploited marine environment. Yet it has been essentially forgotten in many countries. And indeed, it could be an area to focus on when it comes to trying to encourage young members into fishing and sustainable fishing. So in addition, encouraging more selective gear use in exchange for quota, we could protect marine habitats and protect species, whilst also improving in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And similarly, by prioritising fishers with the most valuable contribution to the local economy, we could encourage shorter supply chains and direct benefits to coastal towns and villages. And that, to my mind, is what real sustainability is about. So at a time when we know the power of the oceans is hugely important in terms of mitigating climate change and supporting local communities, we know that achieving the aims of the CFP and ending overfishing is both climate action, but also it's social empowerment. And I feel that this is the direction we should be going in the European Union. And I just want to support my colleague, Rapporteur Caroline Roose, in her objective. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. I would like now to ask the European Commission if they want to comment briefly. I think we have the head of unit of DG MARE, Mrs. Valérie Tankink, connected.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I would be very happy to briefly comment on this very interesting debate. First, I would like to thank the Rapporteur and the Shadows for putting this forward and for putting this discussion on the table now. As you know, next year we have the report on the Common Fisheries Policy, and clearly the use of Article 17 and how it fits in the wider CFP objectives is an element we're looking at closely. So this report will come in a good time for that. Maybe first, just to clarify, there were some comments in the interplay between Article 16 and Article 17. Article 17 is indeed providing the criteria, those are applicable for cases where there are quotas are allocated beyond the transferable fishing concessions. So for member states that have transferable fishing concessions for all or part of their fleet, the Article 17 as such is not applicable. Of course, it's still relevant for what they do, but it has a different meaning. In Article 16, we have a clear provision in terms of member states looking at the impact of mixed fisheries. So there is a shall, from listening to the discussion on the shall and may, that's maybe of interest. When it comes to Article 17, clearly, and that was underlined by many of you, this is for the member states to see how best to implement. Article 17 has been put together to really be compatible with the CFP objectives, but also with the rights under the Charter of Fundamental Rights. That's why the criteria needs to be objectives. That's why they take into account different aspects, socioeconomic and environmental. We from the Commission, of course, we look at what the member state is doing, and I fully share the reading from several of you that transparency should be improved. We have some elements, and we've been writing to member states, and we will follow that up even further, because indeed it should be clear for every citizen to be able to know what are the criteria used. When it comes to the actual allocation, that's a different situation, and for each member state to assess, of course, their rules on data protection and other criteria might also come in. In terms of the use of the criteria, we have been looking with the STCF in particular at the social dimension and looking at issues also of the entry of young fishers into the fleet. So that's definitely an area we're looking at, also more widely, because for the CFP report, the aspects of the social dimension of the policy are of great importance. So that's something we're looking at. When it comes to the allocation criteria put forward in this report, or any binding percentages or things like that, our idea is that this is really something for member states to consider in the context of applying Article 17. Each situation is different, each region, each sea basin is different, each member state is different, fleets are different. It is not for the Commission to impose. What we are thinking of, and I think this report could very much help in that, is to see if next year we can encourage further debate between the member states, and I hope a lot of member states are listening today, because that already gives them a lot of food for thought. Also as a means to share examples and ideas of how they could think of changing their system or improving the allocations to even better align with the CFP objectives. Of course, all of this in the overall objectives, where also member states are very much committed to follow up on the objectives of the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy. So it gives a lot of hooks. It's not for the Commission, but I think both the Commission and surely also the Parliament, with debates like these and others, can help to encourage the reflection at national level and see how best to implement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I know that one of the experts, Mr. Carpenter, wants also to briefly comment before I pass to the rapporteur. Mr. Carpenter, please.
Thank you. I just want to make one point on the small-scale, large-scale issue, because I'm surprised actually that so much of the discussion has focused on that, because as I read Article 17, it's about criteria-based allocation. The words small-scale or large-scale aren't in there at all. So the question is not to resolve today, of course, how much blue whiting or herring goes to different fleets, but rather, is it important to use criteria in how we allocate access to a public resource? I think the answer to that is yes, actually, and all fishing sectors should agree to that and actually be promoting this, because if you perform well on social and environmental criteria, then you should be promoting its use in policy making. So actually, I was encouraged to see in the working document, it's not 30% to a certain fishing fleet. It's 30% should be based on social and environmental criteria. What the outcome of that assessment is, we won't know. It'll be up to member states. But I think it's clear that the point is some fishing opportunities should be allocated according to these criteria. So I was happy to see that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I invite now the rapporteur, Mrs. Roose, to close the debate. Please, Mrs. Roose.
Well, a number of points have been raised. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First off, I would like to thank all my colleagues for their feedback. I will, of course, take it into account. And I will come back to you to continue on the work on the working document. Now, a few points that were raised a number of times. Now, I've heard small fisheries versus large fisheries. We are definitely not against large-scale fisheries. In fact, what I'm asking for is better allocation, fairer allocation, more fairness in this process. For me, industrial fisheries are absolutely complementary with artisanal fishery. So I have nothing against or for only big or small. I think everything goes together. Many also raised the 30% issue. Now, we're going to take 30% of the quota from someone and give it to small-scale fisheries. What we're talking about is implementation of environmental criteria for some part of fisheries allocations. For example, pelagic fishing. It's good for the environment. And if they've made greater efforts to reduce their environmental impact, well, they'll be able to keep their quota. So the entire idea of this report really is to encourage best practices and to push a transition towards a low-impact fisheries model in all sectors. Now, what Ms. Bilbao said on... I mentioned France Pelagic, and I took this information from press articles. Yes, I made a mistake. I admitted it. But if we had greater transparency, if data on quota allocation was published, I would not have to go to the press, to newspaper articles to get this information. So member states are not upholding their transparency obligations. Thank you, Ms. Avram, for replacing Mr. Bartolo. He said that Article 17 was an important lever, and I have to admit that he talked about, or rather she talked about different kinds of quota. We want a fair system within the CFP, the Green Deal, and we do have this issue of small fisheries versus large fisheries, but it's not about putting them at loggerheads. It's about basically taking the differences into account while making decisions. So if French fishers, for example, have gone to court, it's clear that there's an issue there. Now, on your remark on young entrants, I would be very happy to work with you, Mr. Ruissen, with respect to new entrants and young fishers. I look forward to discussing that issue with you. And Ms. Bilbao also then talked about young entrants. Now, the issue is that we have young fishers who are going to buy a very expensive boat because they don't have because it doesn't have a quota. That boat is more than 50 years old, and that leads to maritime safety issues as well. And they bought this old boat just because it comes with its own quota. Then we talked about transfers. I spoke about that. Ms. Schreier said that this document has given you a stomachache. Well, let's talk about this together. You'd raised the 30% issue as well. Thank you very much for your remarks on the report, nonetheless. I'm happy to hear that the Commission has raised the issue that transparency is something that needs to be improved. We are going to work on that. Furthermore, this report will ensure that there is more discussion on these issues in member states. And I would like to reiterate that I'm in no way against large-scale fisheries. I'm not saying necessarily we all have to go to a small scale, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you on this report. Thank you.
Very much. The presentation of the draft report is foreseen for the 9th of December, still to be confirmed. The deadline for amendments on the 22nd of December, also to be confirmed. And the vote in PECH in February or March, and the vote in plenary March or April. So we close this item.